Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Winter Lecture Series from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I'm Dave Brooks, you're the audience, and with us this evening is Patrick Reynolds, who is the Director of Public Programs at the Oneida County History Center. He's a graduate of the Cooperstown Program in Museum Studies and has worked in museums throughout the United States, including Hannaford Mills Museum, Berks County Historical Society, Rome Historical Society, and the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. We are very excited about this presentation. It is National Cheese Lovers Day, and this
Hey,
is a wonderful program about cheese. So, Patrick, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
I do I do have my cheese. Thank you for having me. It's very an honor to be with you and to be talking about a very important part of New York State's history. For those of you who don't know about the Oneida County History Center, we are the largest history-related institution in Oneida County, and we deal with not just Utica history, but also history of all the corners from Boonville to Camden to um, this little topic I'm talking about, which is just north of Rome, uh, is the cheese industry. Oh, let me see if I can get it here. Jesse Williams. This is him, one of a few photos that exist. He's the father of the American cheese factory system. It's pretty much revolutionized people's lives and allowed a lot of changes to happen throughout the state and the nation. There's our cheese. All right. So just so everyone knows, for the purpose of this talk, mostly we're talking about cheddar because that's what New York State was known for. Why do you make cheese? Well, you got to go back in time to when there was no refrigeration, right? Milk is a very friable commodity. It has a very limited shelf life. You got to keep it cold or it spoils, right? So by turning it into cheese, you not only remove a lot of the liquids and sort of condense the food that's in the cheese, but it lasts a lot longer. You don't have to necessarily have it cold like in a refrigerator. You can keep it cool in, the milk house or in a well or some water. But it also can taste good, depending on what kind of cheese you make and what kind of cheese you like. Also, economically, there's reasons to make cheese if you're a farmer. So I pulled up some numbers from 1850. Steak was going at $18 per pound, which today it's probably closer to 18. Um, Cheese was 12, so that's actually a pretty good close relationship. But when you make cheese, you don't have to kill the cow, right? So it's sustainable. You don't have to like start over and do everything, and you can milk a cow for years. And the early cheese making, what was called farm dairy manufacturing, and this was cheese that was literally made on the farm. Um, so how many times a day do you have to milk a cow? Anybody? You can put it in the chat if you know. If you grew up on a farm, it turns out you have to milk a cow twice a day. And in order to process this cheese, the farmer or the farmer and his wife, who often were called dairy maids, would have to spend time making cheese if they couldn't get it to a market. Butter was another option, not as long as the shelf life, but it was a way to sort of cut down the amount of water that was in the milk and um, make a product you can get to market. So I'm starting out, there's a series of these maps that'll help you sort of show the growth of it. So this is in 1800. I don't know if you can see my mouse on your screen, but the main farm dairy cheese industry is in New England, right? And in the 1800, really there weren't a lot of people in the western part of the country. So they were making cheese. They brought their English traditions with them, and Swiss, some depending on where they were from. But there was cheese being made here prior to Jesse Williams and his cheese factory system. There was a lot of cheese being made before the big factories came into production. So you canal people I just gave it away. 1825, they opened something very important to us in New York State, which was this man-made ditch, which you guys at Schoharie Crossing are quite familiar with. And that allowed people to get through the Appalachian Mountain chain and start to go west. It was the highway west. And it had an influence on what was going on with the cheese industry as well. Oh, let me go back. The cheese industry started to move west due to the ability to move cheese on the canal. Even though they weren't refrigerated, it was relatively cool down in the cargo hold of a boat. Um, and you wouldn't ship milk necessarily, but you could ship cheese. And you could see across New York, the central New York, and then further west into Ohio, just like the people on the canals were starting to settle, is where the cheese manufacturing went. This was by 1850. Cheese factories weren't built quite yet. Here's a little earlier map in 1849. You can see how thick as fleas. And there's this beautiful crescent in New York surrounding the Adirondack Mountains of this wonderful farmland that we have available to us. Cows like to eat grass, a lot of free range, sort of just eating hay and things like that. And there was in place a little bit at that time something called a curd system, in which the farmers would sort of partially make process their cheese. They take their milk and they put in the rennet, which I'll get into a little bit more, and they would consolidate their curd because these guys only had like 40 cows, so they didn't really weren't had huge amounts, but they would consolidate their curds in together and make one big cheese, and then split the profits off that. So that's the sort of the curd system. So they're not quite a factory, but they are working together. Here's some tonnage reports. These are off the actual New York State Canal documents of the shipping going on. And you can see pork, beef, bacon. Look how big the numbers of cheese are, especially from this Mohawk Valley area, Fultonville, Little Falls, Utica, and Rome. Oneida County was huge. Herkimer County was huge. Tapers off a little bit as we go east and west, but a lot of that's due to sort of the land and the number of farms that were here. So this is tons. So do the math, right? So Jesse Williams, his family, like many people up here, as I run into and as I learn more and more about history, he was from New England and moved up here just after the Revolution with his father and his brother. And they lived just north of Rome, which is where Fort Stanwix was. And if you guys are familiar with Lake Delta, there's a big dam up there on the Black River Canal, and he lived a little bit about halfway between Rome and the dam. I think I got a map which will show you a little bit more details. He was married to his wife Amanda. He had 6 children, and he was a sort of jack of all trades for many years: a farm, grist mill, sawmill. The Mohawk River was right there, and he had water power. And then he sort of had an epiphany, and he rented out his farm for a year and went across all of New York, I guess. I don't know how far he really went, but he visited the farmers. He was a very friendly guy. They called him Uncle Jesse. And what he was trying to do was learn the best practices of making cheese. You know, how do you do this and how do you do that? Because you got to understand this is the science of cheese making wasn't there. You know, the microscopes and our understanding of bacteria and things like that. Um, it really wasn't there. It was sort of just like the art of making cheese. Um, so he did make cheese with his own cows, and he won in 1850 first prize at the county fair. Um, the state fair actually at that time was in Utica. I'm not sure at this point. I haven't done the research to see if he won any prizes there, but he was known for making good cheese. And then the terrible, well, it's not a terrible thing. His son got married, 1850. And part of her work was to work with Jesse's son, that on their farm she would make cheese. And apparently there was some question. I have a little joke there, but Jesse was going to sell his cheese in Rome to a cheese dealer, and he was getting a good price, because he was an established cheesemaker. And he said, "What about my son's cheese? I want you to buy my son's cheese." And he's like, "I don't know. I don't trust him. I'll only buy his cheese if you guarantee the quality of the cheese." And that really is the epiphany of what was going on. Um, so Jesse took his cows and combined the milk with his son's milk and made cheese and was able to sell it. This is an illustration of this is a little larger than a farm scale cheese factory. You got 3 vats and some presses, which I'll get into as we move forward. But I guess it dawned on Jesse that if he was just making cheese, he didn't have to do the work of milking the cows every day. He could just get milk and make cheese and just be one part of that product. So the first, he went from his 40 cows, and then he got his son's cows milk. So now he got 80 cows making cheese. And it's not really documented of sort of the next leap, but perhaps he made all the cheese he could make with his own and sort of skirted out of the verbal contract, and he was able to get more milk from other local farmers, and was using the milk from 200 cows. This is a map of his cheese factory up just north of Rome. Delta Dam is just north of here. The Mohawk River flows by, and the yellow line, conveniently, is the Black River Canal. So literally, his cheese went out the door, across the street, and into a canal boat, and was able to go down the river into other markets, which we will get into in just a minute. I'm going pretty fast because there's a lot to do, but I hope you're keeping up with me. None of this factory exists anymore, and I'll tell you a little more about that. But essentially, what he's credited with doing is establishing what's called associated dairying. And as I kind of just stated, he eventually used the milk from over multiple farmers and 500 cows. He made consistently high quality cheese using fresh milk, and he improved the apparatus and devices used to make the cheese. Again, this wasn't science, so it was just practical knowledge that he applied, trial and error, and things like this. And one thing he was really known for was sharing his ideas, and he didn't want to be the king of cheese. So he wanted everybody to make cheese because working together, we could all be better. And this is an engraving of his factory that he built in 1851. This is when he went big, right? And he was old. He was 53 years old. And it's located on a pond. And there was a wonderful spring located right adjacent to this. 500 gallons a minute coming right out of the ground, artisan well. And he used that cold water to keep the milk cold at night. So you'd get deliveries twice a day. And he'd get the nighttime delivery, he would get cold and using that cold water. And in the morning, he'd get another batch, combine the two, and start making cheese. I got some arrows here to help you understand what's going on. There are a couple different buildings going on. The make house is where the cheese was made. That's where the spring was. This is where the milk was received. And then to the left, there was a summer aging house, because of course you have to age cheese to get a little sharper and smooth out the flavors and things like that. It was located right on the water. And what that did was allow to use evaporative cooling to keep the building cold or cooler, because cheese will go bad, in a 90, 100-degree building. But he's got the ventilators on top, and I assume you could route the cold water off the surface of the water and keep the building a little cooler. He had a secondary building in the back, which was for winter aging. You actually don't want, you can freeze cheese, but it doesn't allow it to age. It stops the aging process. So it would have been heated in there. This is an actual photograph, one of just a handful of some of the buildings. And there was a little road across the pond that the drivers could come and deliver their milk. This is a milk wagon, and there were these specialized containers for shipping milk. And if you figure there are a couple hundred gallons in there, these things were not light and not easy to move around. So he actually, you can see there's like a dock, a loading dock, if you would, which is up at the level of one of these milk wagons. And this is them delivering the milk to the factory. Again, the window where the milk went in was actually high up the ground, more in line with the milk wagon. And they've got a lovely gantry kind of thing to help lift the several 100-pound wagon. This illustration and several other of these are from Harper's Weekly, which did a expose, if you would, not expose, but a good write-up on it. This is actually one of the winches used to lift the milk cans. There's an outfit called Flywheels and Pulleys, who are a bunch of volunteers that run hit and miss engines and tractors, and they've got a barn full of good, interesting artifacts. And lo and behold, when I went up to visit them, probably one of the few existing cranes for moving these milk cans is in existence up there in one of their barns. If you like hit and miss engines, they're up in Constableville, New York, and explore the barns because it's just deep with sort of uncatalogued artifacts. It's a lot of fun. And here's a kind of crazy illustration showing sort of the cheese fever of New York, I think is what they were trying to get across. Delivering to milk at a great cheese factory. Well, they'd never show up all, it wouldn't work like this. So this is a sort of an exaggeration, but you can see each farmer is bringing their milk to the factory, and it's going up in the winch and getting delivered inside where it gets further processed. Here it is coming into the factory, and there was another can inside and a scale, and it would get weighed. And to the left, there's a gentleman with an apparatus in his hand. He's actually measuring the butterfat content, because when you make cheese, it's all about the cream, right? So they would, depending on the amount of cream, which varies from season to season and from the type of cow to type of cow, you get paid a different amount. And if you notice, I've got a little fish here. So this is like the most obscure cheese making joke, but and I tried to hunt down where the quote came from, and I thought it was Shakespeare, but it goes, you know the milk's been spoiled or been tainted if you find fish in it, right? So if we go back, these farmers, what's to stop them from stopping by a stream and maybe watering down their milk, right? So maybe you'd find a little fish in there. We don't know that that's done. And to counteract it, that is why they are measuring the butterfat. So you're not just buying by volume. You're buying, you're purchasing what you need to make your cheese, which is the cream. And Williams paid the farmers one amount for the milk and cream, and sold the cheese for more, and that's the profit he made for his services. So here's the milk coming in, and then to the left there's a big funnel, if you would, which empties into a cheese vat. This is a small one, patented in 1860. And I made this, I spent hours doing this detailed drawing of what a cheese vat is. Essentially, it's a large double boiler, and the milk goes in, and it's heated with, there's a steam boiler over here, and there's a jacket, and either steam, excuse me, or hot water, either one would work because you don't have to get it very hot. But you'd use the heat from the boiler to heat up the milk and eventually separate the curds and the whey. Which, if you're not familiar with curds and whey are, I would just reference to you cottage cheese. It's mostly curd. Like some of it's called large curd, some of it's small curd. But the liquid part in there is the whey. And the whey is sort of a waste product for cheese making. And Jessie was known for feeding it to his pigs. And he had a great number of delicious pigs, apparently. After the milk is heated, you add what's called rennet. And rennet's what makes it sour and clot and form curds. So rennet is a product comes from another place in the world. Strangely enough, it comes from a baby's cow's stomach. I think it's the second or third stomach. A ruminant. They've, baby cows have the ability to digest milk. Um, just like cats, baby cats can drink milk, but older cats you're not supposed to give milk because they can't digest it anymore. But this rennet is what acts as an enzyme and begins to cause the milk to separate into the curds and whey and get you the curds is what you want. There is also a naturally occurring rennet, which comes from the thistle plant. It was very easy for farmers to get natural rennet from cows. They actually had pieces of cows' stomachs like hanging. You could actually dry it in your cheese factory and sort of warm it up with water and get enough to go into your cheese. So here is inside the cheese factory, and we can see multiple vats going on at once, and they're draining the whey out and feeding that to the cows. We've got some nicely dressed people in the back. Perhaps they are visitors to the cheese factory to see what's going on, and some various apparatuses. These are cutter knives, which I'll show you in a bit, and a specially shaped scoop, which was made for going into these metal lined vats and scooping out the curds. So this is a really good illustration, which was from the Oneida County History Center. I believe it was from a bank sort of history publication of sorts, but it does a really good job of showing you a small cheese factory. On the back right is the boiler where the steam power comes from. On the right is a cheese vat, which has already been curdled and the vat has been drained. The man at the far end is probably adding salt because it's a good component, helps preserve the cheese. And this gentleman's got a curd rake, which he's helping to chop up the curd. The illustration on the right side of the screen is a curd knife. And I think of curds like Jello or thick Jello. So it's a mat that floats, and you need to cut it up to properly get it to cheddar and to get the salt mixed in there. So they would cut up the curds into small pieces using these knives. Some go horizontal, some go vertical. Here's a curd knife laying on the left here. This is actually a curd mill that you could run the curds through and get them even finer. And the little dairy maid here on the left is actually filling a mold with cheese curds, getting ready to go in the presses. A little bit more of the same. I believe this is from the Harper's Weekly article. And this is actually what's called cheddaring. And I haven't had anyone really explain to me fully what this is. I'm not a biologist or a cheese maker. I do make some cheese, but cheddaring is sort of a physical and chemical process where you separate the curd and form them into these cakes, if you would, and actually fold them a couple times and let them rest. And what you're doing is allowing the whey to drain out a little bit more. And it causes some chemical reactions in there to allow it to mature and develop different flavors down the road. So the patent press, you can see on the left, these cheeses were not small. I mean, this is probably a 25-pound cheese, and you can see the racks of them fitting into these horizontal presses. Large metal molds. They were metal because uh, the curds and the cheese is actually fairly caustic. And some of the old cheese presses, you actually see it eating into the wood. The vats themselves were metal lined. And so they used metal molds early on, but eventually they get fed into this gang press. And it had a ratchet and a tightener where you could force pressure and you would tighten it up and allow more of the moisture to come out of the cheese. And then it actually stayed overnight and got more and drier enough so that it would come out as a solid piece. Various innovations were made. Some of these were patented. Some of these were made locally. I know Utica, they were making cheese vats. They were also making the parts to cheese presses. And then eventually the cheese go into the curing room where they would mature for however long you really want. Um, cheddars, you know, the cheddars I eat are sometimes 6 months, sometimes a year. I had some 15-year-old cheddar, which was outstanding and kind of didn't resemble cheddar at all. But these cheeses, sort of to maintain them, they were coated with lard, usually to keep it from drying, or butter. Either one would actually work. And they'd have to turn them over. They'd have to keep an eye out for mold because you would get mold, and you can just wipe it off. Even the cheese you have at home, you can cut off the mold and eat it. It really won't kill you. I should mention about 50% of the cheese factory workers were women. I mentioned Jessie and those farm creameries where they were making cheese twice a day on the farm. The advent of the cheese factories really changed the lives of these ladies in that they didn't have to do that. But strangely, rather than not sort of taking a hiatus or anything, many of them actually went to work at the cheese factory, doing a lot of this work. And here's a dairy made with some, this is an English style vat built into the bricks. Here's some ladies in England moving some curds in their long dresses, which is amazing. And eventually, after it was cured, they get weighed and marked because they do lose weight as they go along. I'll have a half pound, please. Yeah. So at his height, Jesse was making 100,000 pounds the first year. That's the first year. So he hit the ball rolling. And the idea for cheese factories really spread. It took a little while. This is a graph I made of the explosion in cheese factories. Here's Jesse in 1850, where he was the only true factory. And we had some trouble with the Civil War and stuff maybe messing on. But eventually, as they started mass producing apparatus and stuff, the proliferation of large, so these displaced the little ones, and these were the big cheese factories. In 1864, the New York State Cheese Manufacturing Association was formed. They met in Rome, and really their charter said, we want to make better cheese, we want to sell it more efficiently, and spread the emerging science of cheese making. Part of what they were trying to address was the distribution chain, which you put cheese in a canal boat and then it goes to New York, and then we'll get to what's going to happen to it next. But and here's the explosion in the pounds of cheese that were going on. Is that the 14 million? Where did the cheese go? And I mentioned this, down the canal, down the Hudson River, and the big cheese market to go overseas was England. They love cheese. They didn't have enough farms to make enough cheese. We did. And we made it cheap because we had factories. There were markets before New York City. Utica had a cheese market at Baggs Square at the Baggs Hotel. I recently found this illustration at the Oneida County History Center of the interior, and they've got the prices going up here for cheese and butter. And the guy in the great suit here, he's got a little box and he's got something in his mouth. There's a guy with another box. I think they're tasting the cheese right before they buy it, which makes sense. The other place where the bigger market eventually was in Little Falls, and cheese buyers from New York City would actually come up on the canal and buy futures, if you would. You're not buying futures, but you're buying the batch in front of you, and then get it shipped independently down on the boat. And there's the butter and cheese exchange, which is in New York City, which sort of monitored and controlled the pricing of things, making sure things were going well. Here's a later map of New York, and there are blue dots on here. You can see the great cheese crescent across the upper Mohawk Valley into the Tug Hill area and out in the Finger Lakes. Here we are in 1899. Peak cheese was about 1892, and I'll get into some of the changes that brought that about. What happened? Well, Mr. Borden came up with this idea to preserve milk in a different way. It's condensed milk. Now, you and I might not think of condensed milk as like milk you drink, but it's very useful for making things that contain milk. You can put it in coffee, you can make ice cream with it, you can make cakes with it. And once it's pasteurized and put in a can like this, it has an extremely long shelf life that doesn't need to be refrigerated. So that's in 1857. So that made the cheese industry take a hit. The other thing that made it take a hit was the development of the competition to the Erie Canal, which was the railroad. New York Central, 1851, I believe, was from Syracuse to Utica. No, it would have been earlier, but refrigerated rail cars came about in 1851, and it allowed milk from central New York to get on a train. If you can see my mice, on each end of the rail car, they actually filled it with ice, which is what they're doing in the bottom right. And then they could pack in milk, or in this case, there's some sides of beef and some pigs and cheese intermixed with it. But it went fast. It didn't take like 3 or 4 days. It can get to New York quite quickly. Eventually, it developed 1860s. The New York Central had a cheese train, which blows my mind. It was a daily train, ran from Syracuse, New York, to New York City, and it stopped along the way. And it had boxcars filled with cheese, 60 cars carrying 600 tons of cheese every single day. No more canal, right? Happened to a bunch of things. So some other things about the demise of the market. New York lost its prestige with the English market. There were some problems, getting into New York by train was cool, but it still had to get on a boat or a steamer to get across the pond, as they say. And whether it was cared for properly or in the hot, get stuck in the doldrums. There were so many cheese factories in New York that there was inconsistent quality, and the buyers used to considered it unreliable. And due to the good nature of Jesse Williams sharing all his great ideas, Canada went big and were outproducing United States with their own factories. But also locally, like New York, instead of making cheese, we took advantage of just not processing it and sending milk to those starving babies in New York City. Another thing that affected the cheese industry in New York was I call it no free lunch, right? 1896, a temperance law forbade saloons to give free lunches because that's kind of what they did. Um, Free cheese and crackers and some super porridge on the bar, and you buy your beer and drinks for lunch. But in 1896, 1/6 of the cheese consumed in New York was actually eaten in these saloons. So once they passed this law, it was one of the severest blows inflicted on the cheese industry, and it hit them locally. This is a detail of a small map from 1899. I actually live up here in Lee. I couldn't throw a cat without hitting a cheese factory in this area. And the densities is similar to a whole bunch of central New York. Um, Noted on this map that there were some butter creameries. So it wasn't all cheese. There were some places that just exclusively made butter instead. I don't quite understand why they chose it. Butter's a little easier to make. Doesn't take as long. It's kind of a quick turnaround. But so as the trains came, the cheese production regions moved, and you see people watching football with like cheeses shaped hats on their head, and that's what the name of the guys out in Wisconsin. They're cheddar heads, right? So the milk from New York more often got shipped into whole milk, which went to New York City, and the longer distance stuff was the cheese coming from Wisconsin. So here by 1948, it's just a shadow of what it was in its early days. This is some details of where I did my original research is in Oneida County. Precipitously drops off. 1950. Final years in Oneida County, this is kind of interesting. So went from 111 down to only 8, 60 years. And they switched over to making cottage cheese was one, but there was a bunch of Limburger cheese factories. Even until relatively recently, they were making Limburger cheese in Rome. But at the same time period, Oneida County was one of the top 12 making milk. So that basically tells us that they're not processing, but they're shipping it to be used in other factories. So where does the milk go today? You put it in the chat. Does anybody know? It's a big factory south near Oneonta. Yes, you got it. Greek yogurt, about 2 or 3 years back, this was so big. Virtually all the milk, I think except for maybe Stewart's, was going to Giovanni. There's also a big cheese factory north of here. I think I have a shot. Yeah, Philadelphia cream cheese is up in Lowville, New York. Philadelphia cream cheese is not named after Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There's a city or town, it's a small Philadelphia, New York, where this soft cheese was made, and they still make it up there. If you want to have a good time, I use it loosely. They have a cream cheese festival up there, and they had the world's largest cheesecake at one point. They had a man covered in cream cheese you could take your picture with, and they serve all kinds of fried things. Um, but there are also small cheese factories around. Just north of Utica is Grassy Cow, which is they have all their own cows and they make wonderful cheese curds of varieties. The Lowville Cheese Factory, if you go up there right adjacent to it, there's a huge cheese store which sells um, commercially made and some of the smaller cheesemakers as well. So Uncle Jesse, yeah, his legacy, he never patented any of his inventions and he shared his knowledge so that all who wished could benefit, right? What a good guy. We need more people like this. They dedicated a monument to him 1957 in Rome. They had a giant cheese festival and John Kraft himself from Kraft Cheese came and gave a speech. He said, from pioneers like Jesse Williams founded the factory system of processing dairy products in large volume, came the ideas and tools that have made America great. Jesse Williams exemplified the spirit which make the dairy industry the largest agricultural industry in America. Where would our nation be with had not been for pioneers such as Jesse, who dared to do things different? True. Thank you. All right. I'm going to see if we got questions in the chat.
That was fantastic. I really had promised myself not to make too many cheesy puns
I
during
saw
an
them going
introduction.
by.
I kind of stopped myself a little bit, but there's I'll I won't embarrass myself too much on a semi-permanent public platform. Um, with that being said, I'll pop my video back on. But as people might want to use the chat to ask some questions, there were a couple that rolled in, a few thoughts that I had, a couple questions I had, but I also want to
Sure.
throw out one of those. bonus words, like
Mm.
that $65 word, turophile. I don't know if you've come across turophile.
Oh,
It's one of those big words. It's a connoisseur of cheese.
ah.
So you could be a turophile. That's a word I learned a long time ago, and it's one of those. Yeah, you can break that out at a cheese party when you have that big wheel. As people have, and I wrote this down. Cheese fever, I think, is probably one of the best terms that I pulled out of this presentation. So those that are tuning in, make sure you use that chat function. We did have the one question from Katie asking about how long would it take to go from milk to cheese.
So the processing, I've made feta cheese at home. It's a matter of like 2 or 3 hours for the from a milk, heat it up, get it to curdle, cut the curds, put it in a press, and then feta cheese you can pretty much eat right away. Um, Cheddars, at that point, a 1 day old cheddar is really not going to taste like cheddar. It's the bacteria, or I don't even know all the biology of what's going on inside there. But the aging does take time. Um, I think, think about when you go to the store, you see like 3-year-old cheddars and 2-year-old cheddars. Um, but also you might want to think about the shipping time. So if it's being eaten in New York, or excuse me, in England, you actually have a month or two of aging time, hopefully if conditions are decent, that would happen on the boat. These cheeses were packed in cheese boxes. I actually have one at the museum. They're wooden cheese boxes that seal them up pretty good. And there was actually a separate industry of people making cheese boxes, right? Um, so I can't really answer you with days, but a good cheddar is gonna have to be at least 6 months old, just from my own personal knowledge.
Yeah. We have a cheese box in our exhibit as well at the site. So if people are going to come out when the visitor center is open, there's one that was acquired and put in our exhibit from a factory in St. Johnsville. So that's real
Was
near
it
to
like
Fort Hunter.
maybe 2 feet wide?
Yeah, it's a large, and I am
That's a
jealous of
small
the
one.
wheel of cheese. Yeah,
That's a small one. Yeah, they were making. I mean, these wheels of cheese were hundreds of pounds. It would take a wheelbarrow to move them.
yeah. It's like one of my favorite facts about Andrew Jackson's inauguration was his giant wheel of cheese that he had at the White House for folks to come and eat. Um,
Yeah,
oh,
there's a variety of those large cheeses. There's a whole story of a big one. I forget how many tons it was. I cut it out for brevity today. But they used to send them to the state fairs, and they would be as big as a wagon, like a Volkswagen size cheese. And there was another giant one. I think the one that the president had was actually made from New York too, but don't quote me on it.
so I'll pose that question that came up in the chat. How did the New York cheese factory system compare to other cheese making systems around the world? Was a similar factory system common in Europe?
So it depends what time period. Um, Jessie is credited with establishing the factory system, as I described, by taking multiple, 800 cows worth of cheese or 200 cows worth of cheese and combining them together. Um, Europe was doing the curd system, where the farmers would partially process it, and then one guy would have a big cheese vat, and they would all bring it there. And I think that tradition continued on longer. And that's why part of the reason they were importing American cheese is they couldn't keep up with the production because they were doing it on a small scale and never really went big, which is what you need to do in agriculture. But I haven't done the research to see really, because I know there are cheese factories in England now. I don't know when it sort of rubber banded and went through the roof and displaced that, but it's certainly worthy of more research. In my cursory research to put this talk together, I decided that this is worthy of sort of multiple theses that people could write. There's a lot to it from the uh, and then when they get into the biology and other stuff, it gets very complicated.
Absolutely. And I put down a question here. I was just kind of curious if in that research that you were doing, particularly for Jesse Williams, who Uncle Jesse, who I would presume was more like Uncle Jesse from Dukes of Hazzard than Uncle Jesse from Full House. But maybe that's more an assumption than anything else. But is there any record as far as what rate his factory was paying for milk, and if that changed over that course of time? Maybe, as more milk was coming in, the quality of that. Obviously, you talked about the fat content being measured, but is there any evidence as to what he was paying?
So not from his factory. No, there's probably 4 documents associated specifically with Jesse and his factory in Rome. A place you could look. You can write his name down. Xerxes Willard, right? Xerxes Willard. He was another proponent of the cheese factory system, but he took it upon himself to get the prices paid for milk and cheese in the local newspapers. So, he would go to the market in Utica or Little Falls and write down what's the average prices. And he would actually publish it in the paper as quick as he could so that the farmers could learn and not get ripped off the next day. Um, so I think you could sort of, with some digging, figure out what the percentages was. I had a figure fairly early in my talk. Like his margin was like 2 cents on 6, which it doesn't seem like a lot, but there's a lot of work to actually grow the cow and milk the cow. And the cheese factory guy could do a lot of processing a lot of milk in just a few short hours. So more to be explored, I guess.
Yeah, and there's I was going to mention too, at least in some of the research I've done and a couple of instances that were near the site, and you mark mid 20th century as this decline in cheese factories, and I think that it also kind of is shown in some of the dairy association strikes, sort of like these agricultural strikes, these dairy farmers, having issues with who's going to pay what rate for their milk. You have basically housewives showing up at creameries dumping milk out on farmers because the prices had gone to absurd levels and they were trying to shift supply versus demand. And actually recently in the last few years I've seen with the dairy industry in this country has been, sometimes it was cheaper for the agricultural the dairy farmer to dump milk
Yeah,
versus sending it to market. So
yeah.
that's kind of unfortunate. And the rennet that Williams was using, is there any indication? I find it really curious, and yes, it's almost beautiful that it comes from the baby cow stomach or thistle, which I find
Yeah.
really interesting. But any indication which he was using in his factory?
Um, so early on, they would actually like have dried pieces of cow stomach hanging outside or frozen on the door, and they could hydrate it. But eventually, they started to commercially make rennet, and you could buy just you know gallons of it pre-made, which was just easier and quicker to handle, so you didn't have to do it. So, to my knowledge, Jesse was using real rennet, not the fake stuff. I think that um, actually I don't know what I think it's just happenstance that thistle actually works, and I think in different parts of the world they might have found that and ran with it. If you sort of go back to caveman times, where did cheese come from? Maybe um, if you used a cow's stomach as a canteen and put fresh milk in it and rode on your horse for a couple hours, what was going to happen, right? And then would you eat that? Which is they did, right? So
Right. It's
yes,
always interesting what people have started to where do you find out if something is actually edible?
it seemed like
Is
beer.
it,
I mean,
yeah,
beer was porridge that sat somewhere, and wild yeast got into it, and the barley mash, if you would, fermented, and it looked putrid and bubbled and frothed, but somebody drank it and enjoyed it for whatever reason. So yeah.
And let's see, there was a question. I'm curious about this. I think you've kind of touched on it. Well, I will mention too that I've made cheese before, not using rennet. I just use like a quick acid or something like that, like a
Yep.
drop of lemon juice or something like citric acid. And that's really, in my opinion, quite quick. And I was the only one eating it, so
That was
and
like a
enjoy.
mozzarella.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
but there was a question. What is your favorite type of cheese? That's coming from Katie. She says that hers is goat cheese. So those tuning in can leave that in the chat, and if you're tuning in on YouTube, feel free to leave it in the comments. But Patrick, what's your favorite kind of cheese?
You know, I've run the gamut. I love New York cheddar. Um, my brother bought a block of 15-year-old New York cheddar up in Lowville that was like $45 or something like that, and it was incredible. But I like blue cheeses. I like goat cheeses. I really, I must say, I haven't been brave enough to try Limburger yet. There is, do they have farmers field days or firemen's field days down by you guys? The
Not as
county,
much as they used to.
like county fair stuff.
Yeah.
There's one in Verona, New York, which still sells Limburger cheese sandwiches at the field days, and it's always the same. It's rye bread, slice of onion, Grey Poupon, right? And I just haven't. When you learn what the smell comes from and what that's related to, I haven't been able to do it, but I'm going to.
And there's something a little bit different about just having a little bit of cheese like that, or eating it on a hot day where there's a farmer slash field day fireman association type.
Sure.
That's but you had mentioned that in the Rome area that Limburger actually still fairly popular in its production. Is that maybe perhaps like a cultural type thing or a population shift to that area?
It's not now, but 30 years ago. You do see, you know, more Germans like Limburger and things like that. Um, and although you don't see the population wise, there wasn't like a flux of German people coming at the time, but they were around. Um, I think it is just sort of it was a cheap cheese that people learned to like. I mean, I've met old timers who actually ravish it, and love it just because our tastes or maybe modern tastes don't gravitate to it. It probably, it might have been like the Kraft cheese of its time just because it was cheap and it was spreadable and you could take it, in your lunch bucket. It was easy. You make a sandwich in 2 minutes. Um, but not necessarily direct correlation to like a large population of people who were accustomed to it.
Great. Well, Patrick, thank you very much. We're bumping into an hour here, so
Oh yes.
um, appreciate everybody who has tuned in this evening. Those that will be watching it later. I'm Dave from Schoharie Crossing. We have other great programs coming up as part of our third Thursday winter lecture series. You can always find us on social media or send us a message, Crossing at parks.ny.gov. If you want to email, Google us, you can find how to get a hold of us. And I really, really appreciate everybody's time this evening. Patrick, this was wonderful. I actually have some more cheese I'm going to go eat. I had some with dinner, but I'm going to get into it as well. And very nice, very nice. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Be well.